Well, welcome to the Dad Nation podcast, where men go from good to great in their life and love. Now more than ever, our world needs strong, courageous, and compassionate men, because we believe that when the dad gets better, the whole family wins. And this movement is called Dad Nation, but ultimately this is for the wives, the children, and the generations to come, because we believe that every wife and child deserves a father who is pursuing greatness. I am your host, Mitchell Osman, and I am so grateful and I'm so humbled that you've chosen to spend your most precious resource, which is your time, with me today. All right, my friends, I am so looking forward to this episode. I've been waiting to talk with Dr. Nate for a little bit now, and I've been following him for just over a year on social media, on the old Instagram, and I just loved his content. And so I'm excited to bring him to you today. So here's a little bit about Dr. Nate. So he's a best-selling author. He's a formally trained philosopher. He is the author of the new book, Open: Living with an Expansive Mind in a Distracted World. And he's also the co-author of the New York Times Editor's Choice, The 80-80 Marriage, which we're going to talk about. And also the New York Times bestseller, Start Here: Master the Lifelong Habit of Well-Being. Dr. Nate has been featured in the LA Times, the New York Times, the Times London, and has appeared on Good Morning America and talks at Google. Nate co-founded the mindfulness training company that's called Life Cross Training, and he holds a bachelor's degree and a master's in philosophy from Stanford University, and he also holds a PhD from Princeton University. So this guy knows what's up, all right? Now you know a little bit about his credentials and his experience. And so let's jump over to this conversation I had with Dr. Nate, and let's get into it. Well, hey, Nate, thank you so much for joining us this week for the Dad Nation podcast. I am so excited to have this conversation with you about marriage, and we're going to get into a ton of different things about how to shift our mindsets around marriage. And I'd love to hear from you and your expertise and wisdom, and we'll talk a little bit about your book. But in any case, I just want you to know that I'm so thankful that you're deciding to join us today. I know that everything that you share is just going to resonate with my guys, and I know that marriages will be improved because of what you share with us today, and that is pretty epic, man. So I read out your bio in the beginning of this episode, but for those of you or those of the listening that don't necessarily know your details, which is probably a bunch of them, tell us a little bit more about yourself, man. So, like, what's your marriage story? Tell us a little bit about who
Well,
you are.
first of all, Mitchell, thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here. I guess my marriage story starts really in high school. My wife, Kaylee, and I, we met at Boulder High School in chemistry class our senior year. We dated, went to prom, but then we decided to break up pragmatically for about 7 years. And so we got back together when we were about 24. And the interesting thing about that story, I find, is that it sounds like one of these perfect fairy tale, amazing marriage stories. And if I just left it there, I think it would be. But the reality is, once we got married at about the age of 26, which is now 18 years ago, we started to realize we had no idea how to be in relationship with one another. We were constantly fighting over what was fair. We were keeping all sorts of elaborate mental scorecards about the other person's contributions versus our own. And I also was in the middle of a really difficult period. I was finishing grad school, got in a serious bike accident, experiencing anxiety and depression. So we went from this fairy tale beginning to almost getting divorced a year or so after we got married. And that really set the stage for the rest of our relationship, because in some ways we've spent the last 17 or so years since that moment trying to unpack and figure out what happened, and more importantly, how could we create new and more optimal habits for being in relationship for each other. And then of course that expanded out into how can we bring some of these tools to the world through our writing on marriage and our book, The 80-80 Marriage.
That's cool. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being honest and just about your journey, and thanks for just sharing that. It's not always been easy. I think so many times in marriage, like me and my wife, we felt that in our first year of marriage, we thought, man, was there some giant practical joke that everyone just like intentionally not tell us, how hard this is, and let them figure it out. Because we too were super shocked. I feel like we didn't necessarily we weren't set up for success. I feel like there was a lot of people who maybe, you looking back, you think, man, I wish I would have known more. But of course, in hindsight, you can know as much as you want in your head, right? But until you make that connection from your head to your heart, and actually start fleshing out a lot of these things, it really, I mean, yeah, it's hard to get good at it until you're just in the thick of it, I guess, right? So you have this Instagram channel called 8080 Marriage. You have a book called 8080 Marriage, and which we're going to talk a little bit more about your books and stuff at the end of the episode. But can you explain to us just this, why you use the word 8080 marriage versus 5050 marriage? Because we've heard that a lot in culture: go halfway and meet me in the middle, and marriage should be fair and equality, and you've heard it all, obviously. So can you explain a little bit about why you've chosen that sort of brand or approach to it?
Absolutely. The default mindset that most couples have in the modern age is exactly what you named. It's this idea of having this 50-50 bargain, essentially, where we say, I'm going to contribute my 50%, you contribute your 50%. We're both going to keep an elaborate scorecard where we compare our wonderful contributions against the other person's contributions. And the idea behind that is that if we can find that perfect 50-50 balance, we're going to somehow ascend into the heavens of marital bliss and everything is going to be amazing if we can just do that. Of course, anybody who's listening to this, who's ever been in a relationship, especially with kids, because all of this gets way more intense with kids, you know that it's an illusion. It's like a mirage in the desert. You think, oh, if we just get closer to fairness, it's going to solve all our problems. But what it actually does is sets up these incredibly problematic dynamics where we're no longer thinking about how we can be generous to our spouse, how we can be loving toward our spouse. We're instead thinking about, like, I'm doing more, they're doing less. This dynamic is particularly problematic because it turns out from the research on marriage and relationships that we have these cognitive biases. One of them is called availability bias, which is basically just a fancy way of saying all of my wonderful acts of contribution happen right in front of me. I see them all happening, right? I am on the drop off where I drop off my kid. I am there when I'm making dinner. But when it comes to what my wife Kaylee does, everything gets a little bit blurry. I see some of it, but a lot of it I don't even see. So I'm going to have a tendency to
Mm,
systematically underestimate everything she does. And then there's also this overestimation
mm,
bias we have where pretty consistently we tend to overestimate the amount of time we spend on things like childcare and housework. So, if we say we spent an hour and a half cleaning up the kitchen, it was probably more like an hour or 45 minutes. So you put those two together and you think about
mm.
the dilemma we're in, right? We are systematically overestimating what we do. We're systematically underestimating what our partner does. We're trying to achieve this thing called 50-50 fairness, but basing our assessments of fairness on basically pure delusion. And it's clear why there's no way out of this strategy. So that's the basic flaw of the 50-50 model. And that's why we think we need to think about alternative models for how to be in relationship with each other.
So we chronically overestimate what we do and underestimate what our spouses do. I guess it's kind of like that. When me and my wife were buying a house, our realtor said, everyone who's selling their house thinks
Mhm.
it's worth more than it is, and everyone who's buying the house thinks it's worth
Totally.
less than what it is. And I guess it's a similar concept,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Mm. I was talking to a friend of mine just the other day who said that. Well, and this person is very they've been married for 3 or 4 years, and seems to have a pretty good marriage, but have been running into trouble lately. And we were talking about this. It actually reminded me of you because we had that conversation shortly before I had talked to my friend, and I actually used sort of the framework that you were talking about, 80-80 marriage, and it was really helpful. So I know that there's going to be people who are listening to this podcast that do have that mindset of like, I'm going to go halfway, and my wife is going to go halfway, and we're going to meet in the middle, and it's going to be perfect. And so, what kind of advice would you give to a couple who maybe has that mentality? And is maybe having a difficult time in their marriage, and maybe they just kind of keep coming up short. Now, when we talked earlier, you had said something about shifting from fairness to radical generosity, and I loved, and I don't mean to prime you or ask you a leading question, but I did love that how you shared that. So, yeah, what advice would you give to a couple who may be thinking that way?
First of all, I would say that if you are in this mindset of 50-50 fairness and it's working for you, then keep doing what you're doing. All good. But it's
Mm,
not working for most couples. We know that because we interviewed about 100 couples for this book, and this was the theme we kept hearing again and again, was that this idea of fairness is breaking down. And so it's a really interesting question. We are really the first generation in all of human history that's trying to figure out this question of how to be equals and in love. And fairness is a really
mm,
obvious way to answer that question. It makes a lot of sense. It just doesn't work very well. So, the alternative way to answer that question, which is really this idea of 80-80, is to say, what if we just completely shifted this whole dynamic? And we said, instead of striving for halfway, for 50%, what if we were striving for contributing way more than our fair share, 80%? Knowing that the math there doesn't work at
mm,
all. There's no such thing as a 160% whole. But what's
mhm,
really kind of interesting about that aspiration is that, first of all, it's radical. Second of all, it feels really uncomfortable. But third, that aspiration has this way of basically just getting us out of that mindset of fairness. And it gets us into an alternative mindset, which I think is way more powerful and really gets us back to the reason we're married in the first place, which is to be connected, to be in love. And that's this mindset of radical
mm,
generosity. So the whole idea is, how can I show up rather than, trying to figure out what's best for me and calculating my contributions, juxtaposing them against my partner's contributions. The mindset of radical generosity is thinking like, how can I contribute to my partner today? How can I appreciate them today? How can I reveal and stay in connection with them today? And so that's the basic
mm.
idea of this shift. And a lot of people will say at this point, like, okay, this is crazy. You're basically saying that I should be generous even though my partner is not being generous to me, because there's still this residue of 50-50 fairness, of course. And what I would say to that is, yes, that's true. But the thing about our mindset is that it's contagious. In psychology, they call this social contagion or complementary behavior. So if we're in that mindset of fairness, our partner is going to mirror that back to us at every turn. If we're resenting our partner from that mindset, our partner is going to resent us. If, on the other hand, we make this shift to radical generosity, there's a way in which it's contagious. Like, our partner will sort of feel this change. They might not know what's going on, but it opens up a space for them to be radically generous in turn. And that can create this kind of upward spiral effect, which really can change the underlying culture of a relationship.
Wow, I had never heard that before, but that's fascinating psychologically speaking how it's contagious, and we've heard that, of course. I've heard that anecdotally in the past, but I didn't know that this is actually like
Well,
a
think
legitimate thing.
about, just like,
And I
have you ever been in a situation where, you're like driving and somebody gets just starts raging at you? The first thing that happens is
mhm.
you feel rage as well. That's social contagion.
Hmm. Wow. Oh man, I want to go down that
Yeah,
rabbit hole, but for time, I think
right.
we'll leave it. That's cool. Okay, well let's unpack this a little bit more. Maybe take it off the top shelf and bring it to the bottom shelf. So this is a fantastic
Mhm.
idea, right? I love this idea of the 80-80 marriage, but we all know that we're human and we have frustrations and uh, tempers and things like that we're all dealing with. Like we mentioned, there's kids screaming in the background. You had a stressful day at work. Um, all those different things. So what are some practical ideas or tips that you would give men who might be listening about how to actually get into that mindset of choosing to put their partner first and to go 80% instead of 50? Like how can they even start on that
That's such an
journey?
important question because you're right. This is a very abstract theory, which might sound good, but you put it into practice and it's a lot more difficult to actually like do it in reality.
Mhm.
So there's a few different parts to this mindset, which I think can help us operationalize it or bring it into real time, in those situations where we're actually engaged with our partner, the kids are screaming, whatever, might be happening. The first part of radical generosity is what we think of as contribution. And the way to think about this as a habit you can build is that one of the most powerful things we can do to experience or give this gift of radical generosity is just create micro moments of contribution throughout the day. So usually we think contribution, we think like, oh, we're going to plan a trip to New Zealand for our partner. And that might be great, but like
Mm.
what's actually more powerful are those little micro moments, writing I love you on a sticky note, putting it on their computer, making them a cup of coffee in the morning, things like that create this really powerful connective tissue that ultimately brings us into connection. The second piece of radical generosity is appreciation. And I think that in some ways, like if I had to distill relationship advice down to one hack, it would be appreciation. Because what it
Hmm.
does is it basically flips the glasses we wear when we're viewing our partner. So that the default here, the negativity bias of the brain has us essentially watching our partner for all the moments where they messed up or they fell short or they didn't do X, Y, or Z. And when we shift to the glasses of appreciation, we're actually now looking for what is it they did right? What did they contribute to the family?
Mm.
And then how can I express that to them in a loving way? And, we've all had this experience where when your partner appreciates you for something in a really genuine, specific way, I mean, it just like lights you up. So that's a key part of radical generosity is just having a habit of appreciation. Maybe it's before you go to bed, maybe it's at dinner. Finally, there's this habit of revealing, which I think is really important because on the one hand, contribution and appreciation, they're great, but you can't just sort of like contribute and appreciate your way to a more loving, connected relationship sometimes. Sometimes there's something that needs to be revealed. And so revealing is about really like first of all having conversations about your inner world rather than just talking about like the weather or what you did today at work, like really expressing what's going on for you. But then also sometimes there are things that are happening in a relationship that just aren't working. Frustrations, misunderstandings. Maybe it's really radically unfair and that actually needs to be talked about. And so revealing is a way of doing that in a clean way. And I think if you start adding a few of those habits to your day and practicing them together as a couple, all of a sudden you'll start to feel this kind of interesting mindset shift happening.
Mm. So contribution, which was micro moments. I love that. Love that idea. Appreciation and
Yeah,
revealing. Is that
that's
right?
right.
That's fantastic, man. It's real practical tips for anyone listening. And if you're listening to this, and you're a guy and you're married and you're having a hard time, send this episode to your wife as well, because you got a much better chance. I mean, Nate can tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like you got a much better chance of seeing eye to eye if you both are listening to this episode and learning this together. Thank you for sharing that. Hey, real quick, we're going to get back to the episode, but I want to give you a free gift today. So if you're here and you're listening to this and you have been having a hard time in your marriage, maybe you and your wife just feel like really great roommates. You haven't had fun in a long time. You're just kind of getting caught up in chores and the to-do list and dropping the kids off and picking them up. I've got something called the Roommate Remedy, which is a free PDF. It's a guide for you. It's 113 ways to have fun with your wife and spark intimacy again. And this guide is going to teach you and your wife, they're going to give you a ton of different ways to have fun. So that's totally free for you. Listen, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to have the link in the comment section below. But if you're listening on audio, just hit up dadnationco.com/remedy for this free guide for you. Listen, I believe in the marriage model. I believe in you and your wife. You can do this. I'm rooting for you. All right, let's get back to the episode. So another thing I wanted to ask you about now, obviously you are in this world often. This is what you study. This is what you've written about. This is your specialty. I'm an old school guy myself. I still just wholeheartedly believe in the marriage model. I say this in almost every podcast. I do believe in the traditional marriage. I believe in monogamy, all those different things. But in a world that seems to be becoming increasingly progressive, I guess, in that sense, I've been hearing a lot of people say, well, why
Mhm.
would I bother getting married? Why would I give that much of my life to somebody else? Why would I limit myself to one person for the rest of my life? And so when I have those conversations with people, I mean, I know all the answer. I know the answers, and for me, what's true for me, because I've felt a lot of these feelings, and anecdotally, just a lot of people in my sphere of influence would agree. But from your perspective, of course, with your experience with studying statistics and things, why do you believe that the marriage model is still important in 2024? Like, what can you explain to me, or explain to somebody who might be listening, who might be asking some of those questions of like, why should I do that? Why should I go through all that frustration of working together and overcoming these obstacles and yada yada yada? Like, what would you say to somebody like that?
Well, I'm with you. I'm old school, I guess you could say nowadays, in the sense that I've been married for 18 years. I'm monogamous. I think this is the model for me. So I guess what I would first say is
Mm-hmm.
I am totally open to the possibility that for other people, this is not their way of living, or for other people, having multiple partners. If that works for them, great. Doesn't work for me. But I do think that, to your point, there's a pretty strong argument for why marriage, why being in a committed relationship. And the way I would make that argument is I would say, as an individual, we have certain limitations on the kind of experience we can have in this lifetime. As an individual, yes, you can experience triumphs, you can experience love for friends and family members and things like that. But when you are in a marriage with somebody who's committed to you and you're committed to them, it feels like there's almost like this exponential expansion of possibilities, of love, of intimacy, of pleasure that is available to you in that particular system that you just simply don't have access to alone. Or at least I certainly wouldn't have access to that alone. So that's what I would say. I mean, I think, like, to me, the argument is about there's so much more you can do together as a couple. There's so much more you can experience. The depth of love that I have for my wife is beyond anything I could have ever imagined being possible, right? There's like a mind-blowing array
Mm,
of possibilities there, especially if you can get over all those little, like, barriers that we experience, all the fairness stuff, all the scorekeeping, all the conflict. I mean, that is inevitable. It's going to happen in every relationship, but if you can learn how to navigate it more skillfully and how to actually turn those moments of conflict into opportunities for connection, then all of a sudden, like, the possibilities just become like incredible. It's like you can go to the end of the galaxy together
mm,
and back. And there's no way to do that. The,
mm-hmm,
the the rocket ship doesn't take you there when you're alone.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, man. I completely agree. I think, for me, there's so many cliche phrases. There's so many cliches that come to mind that are just they just mean so much more
Yeah.
when you get married, like the old, the day we got married was the day I loved you the least, and looking back, and in our first year, or when I thought I want to marry my wife Sam. I thought I loved her back then, but I didn't know anything. I was really infatuated with her, and I liked the idea of that, the fact that she
Mhm.
could make me
Yeah,
happy, my juvenile way of thinking. But you're so right, man. The breadth, the depth of love is, you actually can't put words to it. And for me personally, when it comes to development and how we become better in a journey together, it's incredible how you grow together, and it's through the
yeah,
adversity. In my experience, it's been through the adversity, it's been through the trials, it's been through the pressing, that you're refined and you're made to be a better man, and your marriage becomes more beautiful. I think I think part of the reason, as I'm verbally processing here, we do live in a instant gratification culture, right? Where we can get everything we want in an instant. And if it doesn't feel good, then we don't have to keep doing it. And the beauty of marriage for me is the fact that once you sign up for this and you decide to work on it, the growth will come, but not without that pressure, right? And that sometimes pain. And that's, for me, the most beautiful thing. You see movies, war, people in war, and they're in the trenches together, experiencing just wild, obviously, conflict, and, in a lot of cases, trauma, whatever the case is, very, very challenging times. But then they go home and they find difficulty connecting with other people because of the fact that no one can really understand what they've been through, like their brothers or their comrades that were in the trenches with them. And there's this unbreakable bond with these men and their partners in war. And I think personally, and I'd love to know what your opinion is about this. For me, that feels a little bit like marriage. When I look back at our marriage, I think no one understands my background. No one understands the pain that I felt in my life or has walked with me through these difficult seasons. No one's done that except for my wife. And so how could I ever imagine having some type of connection with anyone else like her? And so no wonder there's such a strong bond, because we've been through the trenches, we live through the trenches, and yeah, we get out on the field. But there's something, when I think about the parallels between those two scenarios, for me it really resonates, because I think, yeah, that's exactly how I feel in so many senses. And when you experience so much of life and so many great things, and also painful things, you do develop such an incredible bond with that person that's hard to picture living without. Would you agree with that sort of thought process around marriage and how it brings us
yeah. Well,
together?
first of all, Mitchell, I appreciate you for sharing that because it's so beautiful. The description of the connection you and your wife have.
Mm,
I totally agree. And I think that part of what's so interesting about marriage is it's so countercultural. Like the point you made about pleasure,
mm,
I think is really important. We can think about happiness as experiencing pleasure, or we can think about happiness as doing something that might actually be quite challenging, but that creates incredible meaning in our life. If you think about our culture, it's so based on like the selfish indulgence of pleasure, right? Like, if you want, you could just sit around all day, every day, and like go on Instagram and, eat potato chips. Like, we are surrounded by all these quick dopamine hits everywhere we turn these days. And if all we want is pleasure, then we could just do that. We could just like gorge on this buffet of short, quick hits of pleasure. But on some level, we all know that's not actually happiness. That's just like
mhm.
these quick, meaningless hits of pleasure. And that at a certain point, we would say to ourselves, like, God, there's got to be more to life than this. So that's where I think
Hmm.
the practice of marriage is really kind of interesting in that context, because it's asking us to explore a very different conception of happiness, where instead of happiness being equated with
Mhm.
short term pleasure hits, happiness is about doing something really radical, like making this commitment to another person that even if it doesn't feel good, like you think about wedding vows, till death do us part, in sickness and in health. What that's essentially saying is like, even when it doesn't feel pleasurable, I'm still going to be here and I'm still going to do this. And there's so like that is such a countercultural message that's different from, the way in which we approach most things in life. So to me, that's why marriage has so much meaning because we're doing something really hard and it's work. And there are
Mm.
months, most couples I know who have been married for quite a while, and this is true of my marriage as well. It's not just that they had hard days, they've had hard years. Marriages go through hard
Mm.
years, but we still keep going and we get out of those hard years at a certain point. And like out of those hard years come the beautiful years and the beautiful experiences and the deepest love. So, all that's a way of saying like, yes, yes, yes to everything you said.
Yeah, sometimes people ask me, what's one thing? So I have a lot of friends over the past few years who've gotten married, and people have often asked me, what was the most unexpected realization you had when you got married that maybe you weren't anticipating? And one of the strangest feelings was I went through a psychological shift after I got married. When I was dating, when you're dating other people as before you're married, when things don't go right, your inclination is to break up because well, we're not getting along. We don't agree. This is difficult. This is challenging. So we must not be compatible. And the first thing people do is usually think, well, this must not be right. And so let's just break this off. And that's very, like, even socially acceptable, whatever. Nobody would question that. But when I got married, it shifted. I didn't think like our first year of marriage was very, very difficult. I explained this in episode 1. At year 3 was when we really hit, a rock bottom, a turning point, a come to Jesus moment, whatever you want to call it. But the first year especially was very difficult. But I remember thinking, man, if I were dating a girl and we were going through this, I would just want to get out and I would break up with them. But there's something going on in my mind right now, which actually this is causing me to dig deep. And this is causing me to say, no, I will choose to fight for us. And I will choose to do the work necessary to make this happen. And it was the most difficult thing I'd ever experienced. But at the same time, on the same breath, I wouldn't have changed it. And it's such a strange concept when you think about it, because literally maybe 6 months before I was married, that same thought would have led to a breakup, But now it's like, I wouldn't change a thing. Yeah, it's the hardest thing I've ever done, and so it's just fascinating how, for me personally, how it just changed my mindset, and then even that just grew deeper and deeper and deeper as the years went on, and so going back to what you're saying about growth and our happiness, when you think about when we grow the most in life, right? So at that rock bottom point in our marriage, I was also about 40 pounds overweight. We were in massive debt. And we had this conversation point of like, if we're ever gonna have kids, things need to change because we're not bringing a child into this relationship. And so at that same time, I started working out and I started learning about fitness and diet. As we started saving money and paying off debt. And what's interesting is in the context of physical fitness, which you'll know, muscle doesn't grow without being, first torn, right? Muscle fibers, that's how when they're torn and they repair, that's how they become stronger. So there's this intense resistance and even tearing in order for growth to happen. When you want to get out of debt, you want to save money, you don't get there by spending more money and living lavishly and just doing what you want. You have to restrict and intentionally deny yourself and say, I won't do this and I'm going to deny what I want. And with that comes the financial growth. And so many things in life are like that. And it's like, if I want to see growth, there's got to be some pressure. There's got to be some resistance. But for some reason, in the context of marriage, we shy away from that. And people just think, well, it's got to be easy or it's just not working for me. And I just think that's just such a fascinating
Well, there
idea.
is a pretty big stigma around working on your marriage. It's funny when our book, The 80/80 Marriage, came out, one of our friends sent us a message that she had added our book to the Amazon cart, and her husband went into the Amazon cart and saw it there and immediately sent her an email saying like, "What's wrong? Are we in trouble? Why are you buying a marriage book?" And of
Hmm.
course she said, "Oh, I'm buying it cuz it's my friend Nate or whatever." But that was such a telling moment, and there's so many moments like those because you think about like you want to become a better leader. There's no stigma around like reading a leadership book. You want to become more fit. There's no
Hmm.
stigma around going to a personal trainer. You want to like sharpen your focus. There's no stigma around reading books about meditation and mindfulness, things like that. But when it comes to marriage and relationships, we have this thought, this cultural belief that, like, to your point, it should be easy. We shouldn't have to work on this. We shouldn't have to develop tools for this. And yet, in all these other domains of life, which are arguably less important than our marriage, we say, like, oh no, if you want to be a leader, you got to really think about how you're approaching it. You got to create new habits. If you want to be more fit, if you want to have a better diet, you got to like make changes, things like that, read books, get informed. But when it comes to relationships, we sort of say, like, oh, we're just going to kind of wing it. And if I had to just like distill my primary advice on relationships down to one concept, it would be this. Most of us do relationship by accident. And what I mean by that is when it comes to our roles, when it comes to our priorities, when it comes to our values together as a couple, the whole structure of that, it's mostly accidental for most couples. And what I mean by accidental is like there's kind of just this, well, I guess we'll just see what happens. We're going to get married and we'll see who ends up being the trash guy who rolls the trash cans out and who ends up being like, the person who cooks the meals and the store person and the diaper changing person. And the big shift is to shift from doing things by accident in your relationship to doing them by intention. Just taking a step back to be like,
Hmm.
hey, is that actually the best structure of roles for us? Hey, what are our values together as a couple? What should our priorities be? How do we want to design this system together so that it's what we actually want rather than just what we inherited? Because for many of us, it's not just like random accident that's shaping our values and our habits and the way we interact together. It's also just like the values of our parents and our grandparents and their grandparents and 1950s gender norms. And some of those are good. Like, I'm not totally putting down our parents and our grandparents, but some of them are really out of date and really don't work for us.
Hmm.
So anyway, like I think that's the big move here is like how can we shift from accident to intention, accident to design?
Hmm. Absolutely. And that's been my experience as well. We went
Yeah.
into marriage
We
just kind
call
of
it the
winging it.
wing it
There
approach
was no,
actually.
there was no,
It's and it's not conscious. Nobody actually says, "Hey, we're going to get married. How about we just totally wing it and just let random chance determine how we
Hmm.
structure this thing?" Nobody says that. It's totally unconscious,
Hmm.
but it's still this kind of wing it approach.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that in conjunction with even you get, the eager beavers who like really dig in and study all the books. Again, even if you do, I guess, read and research, there's still and you can go into it with systems and things like that. But when it hits the fan and emotions start to boil up, I mean, that's where you got to get real practical, which is why I love so much of what we're talking about here. Three things you mentioned was contribution, appreciation, revealing. Like those things are so helpful. And going back to what you were talking about, the stigma. I talk to people oftentimes. So me and my wife, I mean, we went through therapy lots of times, just different in different seasons, and it doesn't need to get, you know, dire in order to go to therapy. It could be we're just trying to get a new access to a new tool because we got a situation we're trying to work through. But when I talk to people, I explain it like it's no different than any other professional, right? So, for example, the engine light comes on in my car. I don't hesitate for a second to bring it to a
Yeah, you don't say
automotive
cars should
counselor,
just
if you
work.
will. You know, exactly. If I got a toothache, you better believe I'm going to go to the dentist. I'm not going to be like, I'm just going to wing this. I think I can take care of this cavity myself. You're going to go to a a dental counselor where they're going to give you advice, they're going to give you tools, they're going to help you fix the cavity. And so I don't know why we look at marriage the same way, but it's unfortunate. But I find that when I translate that into different scenarios for people, like whether it's a mechanic, a dentist, or they're like, oh, yeah, I guess so. Yeah. And it helps them get their head around that. But like you said, it's the most important thing. I heard a quote, me and my wife were talking about this the other day. I'm probably going to butcher it, but I don't even remember who said it. But they said marriage is unique in the sense that everything in your life could be going wrong. But if your marriage is going right, it's okay. But in the opposite way is if everything could be going right in your life, but if your marriage is going wrong, it's all going wrong. And it carries such a weight in your life and how you perceive other things, the decisions you make. And so, yeah, why not get super intentional, strategic, and focused and get the help that you need? So that's why I love what you're doing, man. I just love your mission. I love your Instagram page, which we'll send people to after the episode here. But I did have one more question for you on this topic of marriage, and that's okay. If there's a man listening and they're considering maybe getting married or maybe getting remarried for the second time, or maybe they're in a marriage and they're having a real difficult time trying to work through things, what are like three pillars, if you will, or three big rocks that people could focus on, or that they could consider when they're about to go onto this journey? You had mentioned values, you had mentioned all these different things. So, what advice would you give men who are listening that are
The
on that
first
journey?
piece of the advice would be to really think about that mindset shift from 50-50 to radical generosity. That I
Mm,
see as almost like the foundational principle. Because if you don't shift that mindset, then a lot of the other things you could do that are helpful, if they're done from a fairness, scorekeeping mindset, they're not going to be as effective and they're actually just going to become a new reason to fight with your partner. So the mindset shift is key.
mhm,
But then after that, and this is one of the things we talk a lot about in the book, and we have all sorts of exercises for these practices, is that there's this whole structural artifice that goes along with being in a relationship. I think this is one of the misconceptions of getting married, that we think of getting married as this kind of like, well, now we're in love and now we're just going to have such amazing time together and have sex all the time, and isn't this going to be awesome? Like we have very much as a culture viewed marriage through the lens of romantic love. And that's not wrong. That's a part of it. But when you get married, you're basically creating a business. You're creating an enterprise with this other person, so it can be really
mm,
useful to think more intentionally about how you want to set up that enterprise such that it gives you the experience of shared success together. So, a couple things you might think about. One is clarifying what your values are together as a couple, because the thing about values is there are no better or worse values, but it is problematic when you don't even know what your values are. And you can think of your values as like, what's the game we want to win at together? Do we want to win at the game of
mm,
making a lot of money? Some couples, that's their game that they want to play. Some couples want to win at the game of adventure, so they sell their house and they drive around in a sprinter van, and that's their game. It's not better or worse, but you want to know what that is. And then there are other pieces that sort of ladder up from values, things like, what are the things we want to say yes to? What are our priorities? What are the things we want to say no to? I think for so many couples, there's this trap we fall into where we start saying yes to everything, and we're trying to be good at everything, the good parent, the good spouse, the good son or daughter to our aging parents, the good coworker, the good
mm.
this, the good that. And for a lot of couples, they get into this dynamic where they're saying yes to everyone and everything. And as a result, they never see each other. Right? There's a study done by UCLA
Mm.
where they found the average couple with kids speaks to each other for about 35 minutes a week. And the reason for that is usually it's
Wow.
because their priorities are totally jacked, right? They're saying yes to their random neighbor's barbecue instead of going on a date night. And so there's a way in which like priorities are key, boundaries are key because that's how you reinforce your priorities. So that would be my big word of encouragement, I guess, for somebody who's entering into marriage. I mean, if I could go back to when we first got married, and if we could bring that level of care and intentionality to being together as a couple, I feel like we would have had such a different experience. It would have been so much smoother. And yeah, I'm sure we would have had some really hard times, but it just would have been a completely different ride. Instead, we decided to choose the purely by accident ride where we almost got divorced. And we learned a lot through that too. But that would be my main advice is just like see if you can bring that care and intentionality and get good at talking, having these conversations with your partner. Like that's a skill that will pay off huge returns.
That's good. That's a lot. I hope y'all are taking notes if you're listening to this, because that's fantastic advice. I know that for me, we read a book called
Yeah, good book.
Boundaries, and yeah, by Dr. Henry Cloud, and it was a game changer for us. Just making room, like knowing what your greater yes is, makes it so much easier to say no to other things. And I completely agree. I see marriages and couples suffering, and their kids are thriving in sports programs and extracurricular activities, but they're not even talking to each other. And they dump all their time and attention on the children, but their marriage is falling apart. And I get it, I get it, but it does take an intense amount of intentionality, and you're right, aligning yourself with what gets your yes, so that then the what gets your no's becomes so much easier. Getting crystal clear on what your values are and what you want to the game you want to play in life. I love that analogy. I haven't quite thought about it that way, but that's a really a cool way of phrasing
Yeah,
it.
we have an exercise
Mm,
that really anybody could do. We call it the life report card. And the idea is to think about all the things you do in life, parenting, work, blah, 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 being a spouse,
mm,
and rank basically grade yourself on each of these activities from A to F, just like you were back in school. What's really revealing about this
mm,
exercise is that most of us are trying to get all A's. We're trying to be a valedictorian at life. But while that was possible when we were in school, it's impossible now that we have kids because like if you want to be an absolute A rock star at work, you're probably not going to make it to all of your kids' little league games. There are just certain trade-offs we have to make. And
mm.
so the next part of the exercise is then to write a new sort of like dream or ideal life report card where you importantly intentionally fail at certain subjects. And that's actually where the real growth comes.
Hmm.
To be able to say like I am going to aspire toward failing as a volunteer parent at my kid's school is so liberating. Like at my kid's school, they have this multicultural night where parents spend all day cooking like dishes from their heritage and stuff like that. And this year when it rolled around, I was like, "Oh, I'm I'm getting an F in volunteering at my kid's school. So I'm either not going to go or I'm just going to go to the store and buy like chips and hummus and put it on the table." Because that's what an F parent would do. And I
Mm.
just saved myself an entire day of work. And I'm not saying like you shouldn't volunteer at your kid's school. Maybe some people want to get an A in that, but I decided to get an F in that. And that's what F parents do. And you can see like how much energy that liberates by just being willing to intentionally fail at certain subjects of life.
Wow, I love that. I love that, man. That's so cool. And I mean, really, it's another way of phrasing, determining
Yeah,
what gets your
totally.
no, right? In order to
Yeah.
clarify what gets your yes, right? And it's yeah, totally. And I think the challenging thing is we get so caught up in the
Yeah.
culture of comparison. And so because what is important to the Joneses and what they're doing, then therefore I need to be doing this as well. And so you begin caring about things that you begin doing things you don't even care
Yeah,
about. Would you
I
agree
do.
with that?
And I think it's reinforced by a
Mm,
culture that says we should be amazing at everything. If you listen to all the like bro podcasts,
mm,
What are you supposed to be good at? Well, you're supposed to eat, like a perfect diet, and you're supposed to be perfect when it comes to your fitness. Oh, and don't forget about meditating every day. And don't forget about being a rock star at work. And don't forget about being really good at investing. And you got to be a great parent. And the list goes on and on and on and on. And the expectation is, again, that you should get A's in everything. But the reality is, it's impossible. You can't, I mean, you literally can't get an A in everything.
Mm,
And so that's where a lot of
mm.
people, when you're in that accidental model, you're trying to get an A at everything, you're getting a C in everything, and it's really frustrating. So there's a big shift that can happen when you start to say like, no, I really am going to go all out at being a really great spouse, being a really great parent, and maybe
Mm.
there's room for one other A at work, and that's it. Those are my priorities. Those are my yeses. I'm gonna really like defend those with my life.
Hey, man, well, that's liberating for me. I'm just applying this to my life as we're as we're talking about it, because I love to work hard. I am very much motivated by accomplishments, very goal oriented, and there's a lot to unpack there
Yeah.
for another episode, maybe. Just with my upbringing and just how I'm wired as well, but certainly have found my worth in my work and what I've been able to accomplish. And so, yeah, man, I'm needing to hear this from you today. So this has been fantastic, Nate, and I want to ask you one last question. And this is not related to marriage, but everyone that I get on the show, I respect and I admire, and I respect and I admire you and the vision and the mission. I think it's so noble, and so I love asking this question because it helps reveal the heart of those that I ask it to. So I want you to picture, as a little bit morbid, but I find that when we think about our death, it really changes how we think about how we live. And so, for a moment, if you could picture, your funeral is just wrapping up, and your kids and your wife are still alive, and you're having this out of body experience, if you will, and the funeral service is over, everyone's gone home, and it's you, or it's your wife and your kids, and they're sitting around the table and they're talking about dad, they're talking about Nate, the husband, and all the different things he's done, and they're reflecting on the man that you were and all that you've accomplished and the kind of father you were and the kind of husband you were. What are like one or two things, as you were be listening, that you would want them to speak about who you are and the life that
Mm.
you lived?
Wow, that's quite the closing question. I love it. The two things that come up, one is I think, or I hope they would talk about he was the rock. He was the grounding presence of the family, the one who was there physically, but also there
Mm,
spiritually, there emotionally. He was kind of just that background rock type presence to the family. And then the second one that I think they would talk about, hope they would talk about, we'll see, is that he was just like full of this creative fire. Like there was this
mm,
unstoppable creative energy to tackle really hard problems around like how do you make relationships work, or how do you stay open in an age where you've got generative AI and algorithmic social media and all of this political polarization, etc. So I think that would be the second one, is this passion, this like desire to just like tackle the biggest problems he could find and see if he could come up with some new way of thinking about them. Yeah, that's
mm.
what comes up.
I love that. I love that. The Rock, and someone who didn't back down from challenges and had a zeal and a passion for life. That's fantastic,
Yeah.
Nate.
Well, and
Thanks for
in some
sharing.
ways that goes with the theme of our
The
conversation. We have a mantra in our family that's we do hard things. That's one of our foundational
So
values,
good.
we do hard things in this family. And I think that's a lot of what we've been talking about. Marriage is a hard thing. Being a dad is a hard thing, but it's worth it.
100%. 100%, man. I'm gonna steal that one from my family. I love that. So the last question here, Nate, is I mean, this conversation has been super valuable. But for people who are listening to this and want to know, hey, where can I get more of Nate? Where can they find you on the internet? And then can you also just tell us a little bit about your books, and then where they can get that, so we can help promote you, but point more of these guys that follow me in your direction and
Yeah,
get
on
the
the
help that
marriage
they need.
side, our website is 8080 marriage, so 8080marriage.com. There's actually a newsletter we put out once every couple weeks that's free. You can sign up for it at the bottom of our webpage. But that I would point people to that, because what my wife and I try to do is every couple weeks come up with some really cool tools, or address certain situations couples get in a lot. So that would be the first place I would point people. We're obviously on Instagram, 8080 marriage. I have my own account there, Nate underscore Klemp. And then in terms of books, yeah, 8080 marriage is available anywhere books are sold. I also have a new book that just came out last month called Open: Living with an Expansive Mind in a Distracted World. And that's out as well. And yeah, Instagram's a cool place too, because I do love the idea that we're building a community of conversations here about these topics. So hopefully, there's a way in which we can continue the conversation there, or wherever, on this podcast, on your platforms, because it's a conversation worth having.
Hmm. Yeah, man. Well, we're definitely going to have a
Cool.
round two at some point, because we're we're just we talked a lot about a lot of good stuff, but I'd love to just get into the weeds a little bit more. Maybe we'll do a question and answer with, or have a bunch of guys to submit a bunch of questions, and we can do a little
Yep,
Q&A
sounds good.
session. But so for you guys who are listening, yeah, for sure. If for everyone listening, I'm going to post the links to his Instagram page, probably to some Amazon links to his books, and his website, just so you all can check it out. If I were you, if you are not yet married, or if you are married, or if you just want to level up in your life and in your love, follow this guy and get his content, because I've been following you now for just over a year, and almost everything I've seen, I've either saved or shared with somebody, or it's just fantastic advice, man. And like you said, if any endeavor is worth our time and attention, it is our marriages and our relationships. So, Nate, I just appreciate you so much, man, and thank you for giving me 60 minutes of your time. It's hugely valuable to me. So, and I know, like I said many times, this is going to resonate with so many people who are watching this episode. So, thank you again. And
Thanks so much, Mitchell. I appreciate it.
okay, see ya. Wow, what a fantastic conversation that was. Listen, my hope for you is that whether you have been married for a long time, or you're newly married, or you're thinking about getting married, that this podcast was super helpful for you. And just as I mentioned in the episode, I'm going to be linking all of Dr. Nate's links in the show notes below. As he mentioned, there's the books that he's written. There's a newsletter called Klemp Insights, and of course his Instagram, which you can follow him there. Listen, dig into his stuff, because he and his wife have so much to give, so much to share with you about this. And so if you've been watching on YouTube, I want to hear from you today, okay? So I want you to leave it in the comments. What was one principle that Dr. Nate shared that really resonated with you? What's one thing that you want to start working on with your spouse today? Leave it in the comments, and let's start that conversation, okay? All right, so that's it for today's episode. But listen, the next week, I'm going to be doing another episode, and it's going to kind of piggyback off of what we talked about today. Dr. Nate just brought up a bunch of things that I personally just want to expound on a little bit from my own experience and understanding. And so next week, we're going to be talking about fighting in marriage, all right? How to fight fair and how to find resolution when you don't, okay? And we're going to be talking about conflict resolution tools. We're going to talk about core values, and I'm going to give you some real practical tools as to how you can resolve conflict if you've lost your cool and you have to come together again and make amends. It's going to be another great episode next week. I know it. So listen, if you are watching on YouTube, or if you're listening on an audio version of this podcast, whatever platform you're listening on, hit subscribe or follow the show so that you get notified when I'm putting out new episodes, because we've got a ton of great stuff coming up, and I want to make sure that you get the first chance to hear everything that's going to be coming out. Okay, listen, have an incredible week. Looking forward to catching up next week. Looking forward to touching base with you as to what you've been learning. Listen, I'm here for you. I'm in your corner. Okay, we'll catch up soon. See ya.